Welcome back. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about the HBox and VBox, and we're going to be summarizing everything we've talked about with regards to the specific layout panes. Now, an HBox lays out its children, or its children nodes, in a single horizontal row. A VBox lays out its children in a single vertical column. Hopefully you recall that a flow pane can lay out its children in multiple rows or columns, but a VBox or an HBox can only lay out its children into one column or row correspondingly. The class diagrams for HBox and VBox are correspondingly going to be a little bit different. You still have the alignment, which allows us to see the overall alignment of the children in the box. The default is going to be the top left. Then you have your fill height, which is resizable. The children fill the full height of the box or not, which is by default true. Then you have your spacing, the horizontal gap between the nodes. This is for the HBox, by the way, and that's a default of 0. Then you have your two constructors, the default HBox and the HBox with the specified HGAP. And then you have your set margin method, which allows us to set the margin for the node in the pane. And that's a void method. For the VBox, you have a very similar arrangement. However, wherever you would have had HGAP, now you have a VGAP. It's also important to note that you might be saying, well, isn't an HBox and a VBox, aren't they just types of grids? And in fact, they kind of are. But the reason we have them is that they allow us an interesting amount of functionality, as you can put elements into it and you guarantee that they'll always be in the same column or row. So let's try this out. Today, we're going to be adding in another stage, but to do that, we have to first import a couple new classes. First, obviously, we're going to have to import the appropriate layout class, which in this case is going to be the HBox and the VBox, both of which we're going to be using today. In addition, we're going to be importing the JavaFX .scene.image, and the image view. This is because we want to display an image in the HBox and VBox, so we're going to be importing the appropriate classes for that. After that, we can now get started. First, we're going to create a new stage, and we're going to call this stage, for example, stage 3. And that's going to be equal to a new stage. Once we have that, we can now actually create a border pane. You'll see why we're going to create a border pane. This is because, in fact, every single pane that we've talked about can actually hold another pane, since panes are just types of nodes, and every single layout pane can just take a different type of node. So, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to create a border pane, then we're going to be sticking an HBox and VBox inside certain areas of that border pane. So, we're going to call this border pane pane, and we can call this B pane, and that'll be equal to a new border pane. No arguments on that. After that, we can now say that we want to have two methods. These methods are going to be the getHBox and the getVBox methods. We're going to be calling these methods. I'll create these stubs right now, and we'll create the methods after this. But these methods are going to be used so that we can populate the HBox and VBox with the appropriate values. What we're going to be doing today is we want to have we're going to create a window called show HBox VBox, in which there'll be two labels. One will say computer science, one will say chemistry. We want to have a US flag on that area too, horizontally oriented. Then we want the background of this to be a different color, for example, gold. After that, underneath it, we want to have a list of courses vertically listed. This will just be a simple list, and there'll be one course per line. This will be on a white background. So we're going to create a VBox and an HBox. The HBox will store the two course names and the flag, and the VBox will store the courses label header, and then the courses we'd like to add. In our case, we're going to be adding 4 courses. So to do that, we're first going to call the method. We're going to say bpane dot set top, because we want this HBox to be on the top and the VBox to be on the left side, and you'll see why in a little bit after we run the program. And we're going to call the getHBox method. And with that, we can now, and we have to do the same thing for the VBox, and correspondingly we have to change that from the top to the set left, and the getHBox to the getVBox. But once we've done that, we're actually ready to create our two new methods. If you want, you can create your scene and your title and your set scene and your show right now, We're not going to, but if you want to, you can do that now. There's no disadvantage. So let's get started. Inside, after our main method, there's no reason it has to be after, but we're going to do it that way. We're going to create a private method. This is a private method because we don't want any other classes to be able to access this method. This should be exclusively for the showPanes class. If any other class tries to access it, then we're in violation of the contract, since otherwise it's going to be creating a HBox, and this HBox is very specifically tailored to this situation. So we're going to say private method, and it's going to return an HBox object. We're going to call it getHBox. It's not going to take any parameters. Then we can get started inside the method itself. So we're going to say we're going to create a new HBox object. Hopefully you recall that every single HBox can take a it has two constructors, one of which is a no arg constructor, the other one that specifies its spacing. We're going to be creating one with a spacing of 15. So we're going to say HBox, and we're going to have the reference variable, let's say, be HBox with no capital letters. It's equal to a new HBox with a spacing of 15. After that, we're going to now start padding, because hopefully you recall that while you can have a spacing, that's not the same thing as padding. Spacing and padding are distinct ideas, since padding means every single thing inside will also be spaced out. But we want to make sure the padding is still 15. So we're going to say hbox.setPadding, and then we provide our value. In our case, we want the padding to be consistent across the board. You can either make this 15, 15, 15, 15, 15, or you can just say 15. We're going to do the whole 15, 15, 15 so that there's more flexibility later on if somebody wants to edit this method. And remember that because we're adding in these spacings, we need to make sure we mark them off as new insets. And with that, we're now ready because it's all been set up. The padding is ready. The HBox has been created, but we finally have to create a background color. The way to do a background color would be either to say hbox.setBackgroundColor, or we can use the JavaFX CSS, because again, if you have a choice, you should always use it, since it takes precedence over the basic method calls and it's more powerful. So we're going to say hbox.setStyle, and we can do this because the HBox is a subclass of the pane class, and we're going to provide the fx hyphen followed by the background color, and then we're going to provide gold is the color we'd like, since as I mentioned, we want the top of it to be gold colored. Then inside our once we've created the proper setup, we now want to start adding in some buttons and the appropriate image. What we want to do is we want to create two buttons, as I mentioned. These are going to be, one will say, for example, computer science. The other could say chemistry or American history. Then we want to create a new image object, and then we want to pass this image on and add that to the HBox. Now in HBox, nodes are added from left to right. So the first thing we want to add should be the one we want on the left, followed by the thing we want next to it, to the right of the first object, and so on and so forth. So the first thing we want, as I mentioned, is going to be that those two course names. We're going to have chemistry and computer science. So we're going to say hbox.getChildren, so that we can get that observable list, .add, and we want to add a new button. So we're going to say new button with the computer science name. Now that we have this, we've now created a button with the appropriate name, and it's been added to the HBox. So now we have to add in the second course name, and we can mark this, we can actually copy paste it because it's going to be very similar. All we're going to be doing is changing the name from computer science to chemistry. And with that, we've now created the appropriate buttons. However, we still have to create the image, because as I mentioned, what we're looking to do is we want to have the two buttons, but we also want to display an American flag. We're going to keep working with our previous American flag image that we have from the past. So we're going to say image view. So we're going to say image view with the image view object. We can call this simple image view is equal to a new image view with the parameters of a new image. And that new image, we have to provide a URL. We can actually find this URL And the way we're going to do that is we can look on Google to find a good American flag image, which I've procured, and this is going to be our link. We have to mark it off as in quotations. And with that, we've now actually created our proper image view object so that the image can be displayed. Now all we have to do is we have to make sure we add all of these things, or we have to make sure we add this image view object to the HBox. That's very simple. Just like with these get children ads, we're just going to say HBox.getChildren .add, and then we're going to be adding the element image view. And with that, we've now finished up what we need to do in this method. Now what we need to do is return the HBox object. And once we've done that, our method is complete. So now we can get started on the VBox. The VBox is going to be fairly similar to this. However, instead of having 4 get children's, we're going to have an array. This array will store 4 labels, and since an array can store objects as well, this is perfectly valid. We're going to have 4 labels that'll each be a course name or a course identification number. Then we're going to make sure we add these using a for each loop to the VBox. Then we're going to make sure we have the appropriate padding on each of these things with the appropriate margins. And finally, we're going to make sure we add the VBox entirely to the new, to the original value, or to the original B pane that we have up here. So we're going to say it's going to be a private method. It's going to return a VBox, similar to the HBox method, and we're going to call it getVBox. Then we're going to have to make sure we create our VBox object. So we're going to say VBox, and we'll call this VBox, no capitals, is equal to a new VBox with the parameter of 15, because we want a default, we want to have a default kind of margin of 15. Just like with what we did here, we want to make sure every single time that we create this, or when we create it, we need to make sure that it has a spacing of 15. After that, we can now get started on making sure our padding is correct, just like before. This time our padding is going to be slightly different because we don't want to have uniform padding. We want to make sure that it's more padded on one side than on the other. So we're going to say we want to have a padding of 15, 5, 5, 5, 5. So 15 on the top and then 5 all the way down, or on the left, right, and bottom. So to do that, we're going to say VBox.setPadding, and we have to create a new inset object. You can either create this now or you can create it after you put in the numbers. In our case, we're going to create it now. Then we have to provide the values of 15, 5, 5, 5, which means now we finished our padding. And then we can now add a label. The way this is going to work is that we're going to have one label that just says courses, and then a colon, and then 4 new values that will be listed underneath it. So first we have to add the title label. There's you could do this by setting a title, however that's not necessary in this case, and in fact there's no guarantee it would work correctly. So we're just going to say VBox.getChildren.add, and you might be saying, well, what are we doing here? What are we adding? We're going to add a new label, and this label will say courses. And the reason we're doing this is because, once again, we don't have to reference this label once we've created it, so there's no disadvantage to making it anonymous. After this, we can now start to create that array that I mentioned, and the array will contain all of our new courses. We're going to have 4 courses. We're going to call them CSCI, and we're going to have corresponding identification numbers. For example, 1301. So we're going to say the label array, it's going to be single dimensional, of courses, and we can call this courses. The array reference variable is not too relevant here. And once you have that, that could be equal to a, inside our shorthand for initialization, we have to make sure we say that we are creating the 4 courses. These are all going to be anonymous creations since we don't need to reference these once we've made them. So we're going to say new label, then we have to provide the name that we'd like. In our case, we're going to say CSCI, and then let's say 1301. After that, we can add another label, and let's say we want that label to be with the identification number 1302, and we can copy paste here since they're going to be very, very similar creation statements. So we change this to 1302. Then we can change the third label to, for example, 2410. And then we can have our fourth label, which will be, for example, 3720. Again, these are random numbers. You can pick whatever number you'd like. This will just be what's displayed on your list of courses. After that, we're actually done since we've created our 4 courses, put them into an array. So now we can use a for each loop to traverse this array and just add each of these with the appropriate padding to the VBox. So we're going to say for, hopefully you recall the shorthand for a for each loop, label, that being our type. Then we have to have our a variable that we'd like. So in our case, it's going to be course. And then we have to provide our array reference variable. In our case, courses. So once we have that, we can now start to put what we'd like inside the for each loop. As I mentioned, all we have to do is we have to set the margin. And the reason we're using the set margin here, you might be wondering, instead of using the set padding, is first of all because we've already set the padding. It would be slightly confusing, but mostly because the margin allows us a little bit more flexibility. It allows us to add in a new, we can provide new values here, and we can make sure that every single time we add a new value, the margin will be changed, because padding is not as precise. By saying set margin, we can provide the course, therefore allowing us a little bit more of a kind of ability to re-reference this later on. So we're going to say course, and then we can, just like before, provide our padding with the new insets. And we'll provide the padding of 0, 0, 0, 15. This is because initially we have a padding of 15, 5, 5, 5, 5, because we want to make sure our courses label is padded off. Now we need to make sure that for every single course value we have, we need to make sure that it's padded 15 on the bottom, so that they're not right next to each other as they're listed. Then, once we have this, we can now add all of these appropriate values to the VBox, fairly simply. All we have to do is say VBox.getChildren .add, and then we'll add the course. Remember, this is our reference variable that we're using in the for each loop. After the for each loop is finished executing, we are actually done. So all we have to do now is just return the VBox. And now we're actually finished. The only thing we have left to do is display this. So to do that, we're going to have inside our main, our start method actually, but we're going to be displaying this, and that's going to be fairly simple. All we have to do is create a new scene, and since everything has already been added, all we have to do is make sure we add this entire, because everything's been added to the border pane object, we just have to make sure we add the border pane object to the scene, and we're actually done. So we're going to say scene, and we'll call this scene 4 is equal to a new scene. And then that's not going to take any, or I'm sorry, that is going to take a parameter. In our case, it's going to take the bpane object, because we want to make sure we add in that bpane as it contains every single sub node that we've created. Then, just like before, we have to set a title. So we're going to say, if you recall, we created the stage 3. We're going to say stage 3 dot set title, and our title is going to be show VBox HBox or show HBox VBox. And with that, we can now make sure we set the scene. So we're going to say stage 3 dot set scene, and then we provide the appropriate scene, in our case scene 4, and then we can now just display this by saying stage 3 dot show. And with that, we're actually done. So to review what we did here, we created a new stage, we created a new border pane object, then we initiated a new HBox method call, and we set that to the top. The HBox method call creates a new HBox, has a background color of gold, is padded by 15 on all sides. It has 2 buttons, computer science and chemistry, which will be right next to each other, but they'll be appropriately padded so they're not lined right up against each other. There will be some space. And then we have our US flag appropriately displayed in the appropriate horizontal direction. Then we've added everything into the HBox, and then we return the HBox. Similarly for the VBox, we've created a title of courses Then we have an array of 4 course names. Then using a for each loop, we set the appropriate margin and add every single course inside the course loop inside the course array into the VBox, and then we return the VBox so that it can be displayed. So let's try this out. If we run our program, you can see that we're actually going to have 2 buttons, computer science and chemistry, and then we have our flag. Now the reason that this VBox is so large is that we actually have said that we want the flag to be its original size. If we didn't, then the flag could be shrunk down and therefore the HBox could take up less space. However, in our case, we don't want that. Then we want to make sure that we have we had all of our courses here, which we do. They're appropriately displayed and they have the appropriate lining up. Now you might be looking at this and saying, well, where's my gold color? The gold color is actually the background for each of these values. So there is a background, it's not very visible, but there is a gold background. Hopefully you found this lesson useful. To summarize, in today's lesson, we talked about how to use a HBox and VBox, how you can add a pane into another pane, and we talked about how to leverage arrays and use them inside appropriate panes. Hopefully you found this lesson useful, and hopefully you found our discussion on panes over the past few lessons extremely useful in your own code.